You're watching CTS, family-friendly television.
Hi and welcome to Rhonda London Live. On the show today, the Ontario government is cracking down on organized crime by going after the money. It has introduced legislation that will use civil law, not criminal, to seize assets from suspected gangsters, even if charges are not laid. That means the government can freeze and seize property without proving its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The idea is to protect the public from the mafia, but critics want to know who will protect the public from the police and the provincial government. What do you think about this proposed legislation? Is organized crime a serious enough problem to warrant the end of due process? And is it possible that the innocent may suffer along with the guilty? As always, the phones will be open to take your calls to hear your thoughts, so don't go away. We're back right after this.
My name is Karen Selleck. I'm a lawyer in private practice in Belleville, Ontario. I also write a regular monthly column for Canadian Lawyer magazine, and I contribute occasionally, not regularly, but from time to time to opinion pages of the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and various other newspapers. I'm here today at my own expense, not representing anybody else, just on my own time, because I think that Ontario would be making an enormous and irrevocable mistake if it enacted Bill 155. And I'm here to ask you, in fact, to beg you not to pass this bill and not to pass any variation of it.
The Ontario government is getting tough on organized crime by hitting criminals in the pocketbook. It has introduced new legislation that would allow police to seize the property of suspected gangsters, even if criminal charges are not laid. With her thoughts on this, we're joined by Dr. Margaret Beare. She's an associate professor in the sociology department at York University. She is the director of the Nathanson Centre for the Study of Organized Crime and Corruption at Osgoode Hall Law School, and she's also the author of Criminal Conspiracies, Organized Crime in Canada. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
What is your initial reaction to this proposed legislation?
The reason I was so pleased to be here today is the fact that I am absolutely, frightened by it, basically. Because, again, it's not even just this legislation. It's sort of almost symptomatic of a whole pattern of it's as if it doesn't matter what we bring in or at what cost in terms of violations of rights, as long as we can use the rhetoric of organized crime to justify it. Which, of course, puts me in a somewhat of a peculiar position, right, because I do, in fact, care, sincerely about organized crime, and I take it very seriously. But so many pieces of legislation and police policies and all the rest of it are being justified under the umbrella of organized crime, and as far as I would argue, to a large extent, have very little to do with organized crime, or have very little to do with a meaningful strategy to tackle organized crime.
Well, you say this legislation is really just simply sinking to the lowest common denominator. What do you mean by that?
I'm not sure that I said that it actually sunk to the lowest common denominator, but yes, fairly much so, in the sense that, we talk about, in fact, the Ontario government talks about, learning, lessons learned. Now, there are so many powerful lessons that we can learn from jurisdictions that have this legislation, and what we ought to be learning is the wide range of abuses that tend to come as a result of this. You don't have to charge the person. In fact, not only that, you can charge the person and find them not guilty and still take their assets. And again, I imagine, I've looked at and studied the draft legislation. As far as I know, I have not seen the regulations yet, and maybe the argument is that the regulations are going to be so tight that we can sort of feel safe. they've never been safe anywhere else. You go after the most vulnerable. You don't even go after your high echelon organized crime figure.
How dangerous is it when you have the police stepping in and seizing property and assets without due process of law? When you move the case from criminal court, where you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt, to civil court, where it's just based on the preponderance of the evidence, which is a much lesser standard.
Absolutely, absolutely. I guess one of the things that worries me is the fact I don't know why it doesn't worry the police from the point of view of the invitation to corruption. Now, we've already seen enough corruption as it is, without a piece of legislation that may, in fact, welcome the setting up of evidence. And again, you put that together with some, in some cases, federal legislation that they're proposing in terms of justifying extension of police powers. I think you've got a really powerful and a very dangerous combination.
What's going to prevent, if this legislation indeed passes in this province, what's going to prevent, let's say, a neighbor of mine who doesn't like my dogs barking, getting really annoyed and phoning up the police and saying that I'm running a drug trafficking operation through my house, and having the police come in and seize my property? And then, instead of being assumed that I'm innocent, I have to prove I'm not guilty.
Well, and again, the supporters of the legislation will say, well, that won't happen. No. That won't happen. Well, again, I mean, anybody that is interested, can look at the array of websites in the states right now that are set up to basically illustrate that exact issue. That we like in Canada the idea of innocence until proven guilty,
right.
And we like that as like a base, as you said before, as a baseline. And this does, in fact, sink below that level.
And if the police and the provincial government come in and they seize your assets, how can you even mount a credible defense of yourself, even to get your property back, if your bank account is frozen?
Well, and I think the legislation perhaps does allow for some use of funds for that purpose. But the point being that the very vulnerable person, the organized criminal, is going to have a very well-paid lawyer. Thank you very much. And maybe we don't need to be concerned about that person. The person I'm concerned about is the person who, in fact, has never dealt with lawyers, doesn't know the language of law, is in fact vulnerable in a very real sense. One of the things that I find particularly distressing about Ontario bringing this in is Ontario keeps using the rhetoric of the first province in Canada to seriously try to take the proceeds away from organized crime. Well, excuse me, but we do have proceeds of crime legislation at the federal level, criminally based proceeds of crime legislation, and Ontario is one of the provinces that uses it the least. And the reason they use it the least, one of the reasons, is likely because the Attorney General has to sign an undertaking to accept some responsibility if, in fact, the case is a wrong one. The person is innocent. So I was looking through this draft legislation to see what kind of accountability there would be if, in fact, somebody, your neighbor sets you up, your assets are seized, what kind of recourse can you have? Now, yes, you can go to court and all the rest of it, but in terms of is anyone taking responsibility, the legislation very clearly specifies that no recourse is available to you in terms of holding anyone responsible for that activity, as long as it was done in good faith.
Well, let's face it, even in Canadian courts where there is due process, in some of the most serious cases, there can be a miscarriage of justice. I'm thinking of Guy Paul Morin, Paul Sofino, David Milgaard. I mean, these are men who are wrongly accused of murder, spent many years behind bars, and then have been proven innocent.
Yeah. And
so that's even with due process.
Absolutely. And the philosophy behind this legislation seems to be, we know who is guilty. Sometimes we just can't prove it. We can't prove it because we don't want to prioritize it. We don't want to bother building cases, because why bother if you've got this mechanism? But we know who is guilty. And because we know that, then we can confidently go about seizing the assets civilly. And as you say, there's a whole and growing volume of cases that indicate to us that we don't always know.
Dr. Beare, do you think that there's a better remedy for tackling the problem of organized crime in this province? Perhaps better police work, maybe spending more money on creating a special unit just to tackle organized crime?
Well, and there are some units like that already. There's the integrated proceeds of crime units that Metro and the OPP can and do have members in, although it is largely an RCMP operation. The police, and I fully agree with the police on this point, the police for the last 10 years have been significantly cut back in terms of resources. I would much prefer that, in fact, up front, very clear, they asked for resources for doing what in some cases is very traditional law enforcement, just building good cases. And, to some extent, it will always require a prioritizing of which cases you're going to go after. Now, the point being that perhaps some of these cases, in terms of at the provincial level, being sort of financial cases, maybe the police would choose not to prioritize them. That's fine. But then don't turn around and say, well, we're not going to prioritize them in terms of using our resources to build cases, but hey, we've got this really handy piece of legislation now.
Well, I think a lot of people have that Hollywood image of, the mafia head, living in this beautiful mansion with luxury cars and indoor swimming pools and the whole 9 yards. In reality, though, how much of a problem is that in Canada?
Well, and again, it would not be correct for me to say it's not a problem. It is a problem, but I guess again I come back to the argument that I don't think organized crime is as it tends to be portrayed. The more we look so almost ethnographically at organized crime groups, what we tend to see is a whole lot of fairly independent entrepreneurs. They're criminals, they're serious, but they're independent entrepreneurs that in fact can be, traditional law enforcement can be applied and cases can be built and they in fact can be charged and successfully convicted. I think sometimes we maybe even hide behind the idea that we've got to take out the entire criminal organization, and by golly, because we don't have resources to do that, what can we do? So we, sort of wring our hands. Well, we don't wring our hands. We go ahead and try to do what we can, but I would be putting resources into policing, sort of an honest representation of where it's needed. This legislation talks about task forces. Again, seem to be somewhat modeled on the IPOC units, the Integrated Proceeds of Crime units, and maybe, in fact, Ontario needs to have that kind of an approach where you bring in your forensic accountants and all the rest of it. But again, be focusing on the criminal cases and not the civil ones. Okay,
I want to talk to you more about that. But first, we have to take a commercial break. Also, our phone lines are open. I want to hear your thoughts on this issue today. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302.
I'm not here to tell you that I think this bill could be tweaked in any way or amended in any way that would make it okay. That's not my position at all. I think it's plainly and simply wrong from start to finish, and it simply must not proceed. And I don't think there's anything that you could do, any minor amendments, major amendments, that would make this okay.
Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The Ontario government is going after organized crime by hitting criminals right in the pocketbook. The government wants to make it easier to seize property, boats, home, cars, anything that could be from the proceeds of crime. The only difference is they want to move the matter from criminal court to civil court, where the preponderance of evidence is not nearly as strict. We're joined in studio by Dr. Margaret Beare, who's very concerned about this proposed legislation. Phone lines are busy today. People are calling, want to make some points on this. So let's go right to Rick on line 4. Go ahead, Rick. You're on the air. Hi, Rick. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Hi. Fine. Go ahead.
I am really concerned about the fact that this lends itself really badly to major abuses, and it would almost fly in the face of things that have been given to us in the Charter of Rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, you bring up an excellent point, and Jim Flaherty, Ontario's Attorney General, has addressed that point, and he says that property rights are not entrenched in the Constitution.
And that's probably they'll probably be fighting that out in terms of in fact whether or not it is a violation. And so I think we all have to just wait for that. I don't know what the answer to that would be. I mean, some of us, I guess, would be hoping that when they do bring the cases, that in fact they will not stand up because of that.
But don't Canadians, even if property rights are not entrenched in the Constitution, don't we have the expectation of due process of law?
Well, I think I would hope we do. I think
before
we do.
Somebody takes your house or freezes your bank account.
Yeah, at the most casual level, the idea of innocence until proven guilty. I mean, I was speaking to some of the lawyer colleagues at Osgood yesterday, and the phrase sort of quasi-criminal was used to describe this. That at the Ontario level, I mean, there's a major jurisdictional issue between what is federal government and what is provincial, and obviously anything criminal would be federal. So here it's civil, but what does it do? I mean, it has the impact of taking away people's assets. So it just seems like sort of going quasi-criminal through the back door.
Well, I don't think any law-abiding citizen is going to sit around and, enjoy the fact that criminals might be living large, fancy houses, fancy cars, and meanwhile, while the average ordinary citizen is going to work and paying their taxes. I don't think anybody's happy about that. Yeah. But does this open the door to abuse?
Well, again, I would think that it does. And maybe sort of go back for a moment, and I don't know all the details, but in terms of provincial versus federal, the rhetoric of this legislation keeps using the term organized crime. Now, when we think of organized crime, we think of drugs, we think of immigration, we think of things that are, federal government, tend to be federal government prosecutions. So what are we talking about? One is afraid, or I am afraid, that it is really going to sort of reduce itself to the level of yes, telemarketing is very serious, and yes, lives are destroyed by those kinds of frauds. But will it go after the Bay Street schemes, the stock market schemes, where again you've got sort of high-powered individuals who will actually be able to defend themselves against this kind of legislation? I think we'd have to wait and see, but it would be questionable.
Does it soften your opinion? The Ontario government has announced what it wants to do with the proceeds of all the property that it seizes is set up a fund for victims of crime. Does that soften your position at all?
Well, no, because then when you look at the legislation, yes, victims of crime is mentioned in there as well, but other things are mentioned as well. It does specify, and again, the releases specify that the funds would not go directly back to the police, but it talks about the police being able to request funds to compensate them for activities that they've had to do in order to restore justice and to prevent the victimization from organized crime. So I'm thinking to myself, if they're being recompensed for costs incurred while preventing the victimization of organized crime, that sounds to me like they're getting funded for doing their organized crime investigations. So, I mean, again, I think we'd have to perhaps see the regulations and maybe see how it actually ended up being used. But I suspect there's going to be money, if not hopefully directly back to the police, but fairly directly back to law enforcement.
In the United States, in some states, there have been very soft seizure laws that haven't worked particularly well. We've seen, like on Dateline and Primetime, you've seen these horrific cases where innocent people have just been driving along and had their cars seized.
Yeah. Well, what is absolutely fascinating to me, again, is this idea that this legislation is supposed to be the result of the best lessons learned elsewhere. Now, if we wanted a lesson, all we need to do is look at what's happened in the States. But even further than that, we see that the federal government in the United States has really clawed back on the kind of civil seizure powers they did have because of a clear recognition of the kind of abuses that are involved. So at the same time, the United States is moving back, and in fact then at the federal level has put the onus on government to prove the case, and instead of the reverse onus aspect to it, the Ontario government merrily goes along and introduces this piece of legislation.
Is it too much temptation to say to a police department that if you seize property from people who are just suspected of being involved in organized crime, in some way you're going to benefit from those proceeds? Is that too much human temptation?
Again, what we know is based on experience of countries that have those powers, like the United States, and the answer is it's too much temptation. You go after the vulnerable, you go after the easy cases, you go after the ones where the assets are particularly attractive. And sometimes you do it in an out-and-out corrupt manner, so that in fact, because again, it's based on this notion that you basically know who's guilty anyways. So it's that in Australia they talk about sort of worthy cause corruption, where you know who's guilty, and you're just sort of facilitating the removal of those assets. I would think that the police themselves would be, to some extent, afraid of this kind of legislation in terms of the kind of temptation that is out there for their members.
Dr. Margaret Beare, our time is gone, but I want to thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation. Phone lines open. The number to call is 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with Police Perspective right after this.
But the most important thing that I want to stress to you today is this. In my view, Bill 155 is one further step down the already slippery slope that Canada is taking towards becoming a police state. This bill will give the government a stake, a very big stake, in the continued existence of organized crime. Money is a big motivator, whether for individuals or for governments. This bill promises to pour money into government coffers. In effect, it will make the government a senior, silent partner to organized crime. Once government can seize the proceeds of crime or assets suspected of being used in a crime, it will become addicted to that source of funds, just like any junkie. And then we'll never be able to repeal this law, no matter how much evil we see it doing, no matter how many police officers or judges it corrupts, no matter how many innocent people lose their houses, their money, or even their lives.
Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The Ontario government wants to crack down on organized crime by making it easier to seize the proceeds and the property of crime from organized criminals. What do you think about this? Joining our conversation, Staff Superintendent Rocco Cleveland. He heads up detective support for the Toronto Police Service. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
Obviously, you're in favor of this proposed legislation.
Well, I think the police services in Ontario would certainly be in favor of it. It's another tool in the basket for us.
Isn't there an easier way, though, to go after organized crime? What about just building better cases and prosecuting criminals in the criminal court?
Well, we build better cases to prosecute criminals, and I think we do a fine job at the prosecution end of things with the tools that we have at the present time. But we're always looking for new tools, new opportunities. We have to remember this is a global market. Organized crime is a global issue. Canada is influenced by organized crime. It's an issue that we have to deal with. We have to be out in front of it all the time. And I don't think there's a problem with exploring new avenues.
But what mechanism is in place, though, to protect the innocent?
Well,
and the very basis of Canadian law is the assumption of innocence.
Well, let's not demonize the police in this issue. The police are the lawful authority for the people in this country. We are those that are put out there on the front line to try and deal with these things. The governments, the government of Canada, the government of Ontario, try to assist the community here in dealing with the problem of crime, be it organized crime, be it just crime in the street. I think what we're trying to assess here and what we're trying to deal with is the issue of organized crime through any means available to us to deal with some of the issues, such as the profits from telemarketing issues, the profits from credit card scams, the profits from drugs, those kinds of issues. So I think let's not demonize the police as being the individuals out there seizing the innocent individuals' assets. That is not the intent of this law, and it's certainly not the intent of the police.
But doesn't it open the door, though, to potential abuse? Let's just say, even if just a mistake is made, or the scenario that I talked about at the top of the show, where somebody gets annoyed at you, or someone is out to get you, and they phone up the police and they make a bogus claim that, let's say, you're running a drug house, you're selling drugs out of your house.
Let's remember the responsibility of the police in these issues is to conduct a thorough investigation of the matter. And I mean, to me, it's...
But shouldn't that investigation, though, be conducted beyond a reasonable doubt rather than just the preponderance of the evidence?
The investigation in the first instance is certainly going to deal with the issue of you, whether or not you're trafficking in drugs. And if there is an opportunity to arrest you and deal with the issue through the normal criminal process, then that is going to be the avenue that is taken. What we're talking about here is, in reality, those assets that are out of country, those assets, especially in the matters of telephone scams that go on, of the 411 scams that go on, where we have large amounts of assets going out of country through the banks in this province, and the ability of the police to, in a timely fashion, seize those assets so that they do not disappear. Some of the trials involved in these issues are 7 years in length, and over those 7-year periods, these assets just disappear. And what I think the government is trying to do in this case is to deal with the issue of seizing those assets so that they can be held. We're not talking about the ma and pa issues here. We're talking about large organized crime issues. And I would think that there would have to be some faith in our judicial system, first and foremost, that these issues have to go before. This is not a police officer in a station making a decision to seize assets. This goes before a gatekeeper, this goes before the courts, this goes before the judiciary, and those are the checks and balances that are in place and will be there.
But what's frightening to me as just an ordinary citizen, it's frightening to me that assets can be seized without a criminal charge even being laid.
No, well, I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
Mike Hare says that
yes.
That's the scenario, that could happen.
Yes.
And that's the beauty of this legislation.
It is one of the opportunities. But I think, quite frankly, the issue is the police are engaged in the prevention of crime. The police are engaged in the prosecution of criminals that are involved in crime. But there also has to be a balance here in respect to issues such as Martin, where you have to balance the cost of a prosecution. If there is evidence in regards to criminal activity with large proceeds being drained off of our community, then we have to have the ability in some fashion to weigh against the cost of a prosecution in the millions of dollars versus the seizure of assets. To me, this is another tool. That's what it is. It is not the be-all and end-all. It is not the answer. It is an opportunity to have another tool in the box to deal with the issues.
But if I'm driving down the QEW and I get a speeding ticket, let's say just $185 speeding ticket, I get my day in court.
Yes, you do.
I enjoy due process.
Yes, you do.
This legislation circumvents that.
No, there is due process in the civil courts as well as there is in the criminal courts.
Yeah, but in the criminal courts, you have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt.
The Crown, yes.
With a surety. In civil court, it's a much lesser standard.
It's a preponderance. Yes, it is. It is.
So okay, you know what preponderance of the evidence means? It means more likely than not.
Yes.
Well, that's wide enough to drive a truck through.
Yes, but I think, again, there has to be some faith in the judiciary here, and certainly in the Crown Law Office, and in the police services at large. Are there problems? Yes, there are problems. There are problems in every part of society, but I think, quite frankly, we deal with those problems as they come to us. We deal with them when we have issues such as members of both the judiciary and the police services that are not up to standard. However, we still have to have and be looking at the best way of dealing with some of the issues that are taking huge amounts of money out of our society. The cost to the medical aspect of our the medical costs that we have to endure, I would say the credit card ratings that all of us have to deal with, the insurance rates that we all have to deal with, all of those issues in some way are impacted by organized crime. If we have large credit card scams, who pays for that? Certainly it's the users of credit cards in increased interest rates. Those are things that are just, somebody has to pay the price. Why should it be the public?
Okay, our phones are ringing. Let's go to Antonio on line 8. Go ahead, Antonio. You're on the air.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm fine. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a question here that,
sure.
You know, if I'm driving along in my car and I'm suspected of being or knowing people that are involved in organized crime, will my car, even though that I'm not involved in organized crime, be seized? And that's what I'm worried about. And if it is seized, then I got to wait to go through the whole process and the court systems and legal fees and this and that. And in the meantime, my car may be sold in the meantime. And then after, what's going to end up happening? Now, what the gentleman is saying, I understand that it's another tool for police, but police don't actually have that much time to just sit there and make a decision. They make split decisions, and then they leave it up to the courts and the prosecutors to get enough evidence to, you know, seize and prosecute people on crimes like this. And I think that it's going to work in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, I think a lot of innocent people are going to be dragged through the whole system.
Antonio, I want to thank you so much for your phone call. What about the question of guilt by association?
Well, the last time I looked in the criminal code, it wasn't there, and I don't think it is today, and I don't see that as a real issue. The caller was absolutely right. There's more than enough high-end issues to keep the police busy on a daily basis. The issue of an individual driving down the street with his car, and because he is thought to be associated in having that car seized, is not a reality. It's simply not a reality. Yes, there have been lessons learned. There have been mistakes made, and I'd like to people to remember that. Again, it is not the police services that create these laws. Our job is to enforce the laws, and we will enforce the laws with the regulations that are built around them, and we will enforce the laws as they're created by the governments of this country. We do not interpret the laws. The laws are interpreted by the Crown Law Office, by common law, by the bench. That's where those interpretations belong. And we take great pride in the fact that we listen, and we are directed by the bench, and we are directed by the Crown Law Office of this province. I think we do very well in respect to it. Can we do better? Certainly. We can always do better. And I would say to you and to the people that we are always trying to do a better job in respect to the issues of what the public is required to pay as a result of crime in this province.
Okay, I want to talk to you more. But first, we have to take a commercial break. Couple phone lines open right now. The number to call, 905-332-3131 or 416-203-0302. We're back with more right after these messages.
You probably know that asset forfeiture has become big business in the United States since about 1984, when they beefed up their racketeering laws. Hundreds of asset seizure laws have been passed since then, and thousands, literally thousands of property seizures take place every week. Yes, every week. Many of these seizures are based on the flimsiest of suspicions, and in a huge percentage of cases, the people whose money or other assets get seized don't even try to get their property back. They can't afford a lawyer, or they can't afford to take time off work to go to court, so they simply throw in the towel. And every time this happens, the cop who made the bust gets some brownie points, and he becomes emboldened to do it again. Here are some of the grounds on which American citizens have had their property seized. One really common situation has been when they've been stopped on the highway for minor traffic violations, or even for routine alcohol or seatbelt checks. Just imagine here in Ontario, police stopping people under the RIDE program. They have a cute little spaniel with them, trained to sniff for drugs. Did you know that in the US and Britain, they've done studies that have shown that between 80 and 96% of all the paper currency in circulation has traces of cocaine on it? Now, I've never seen any statistics for Canada, but I have no reason to believe that it would be any different. In the US, 15% of the paper currency leaving the mint, leaving the US Treasury Department straight off the printing presses, has traces of cocaine on it. So just turn those sniffer dogs loose at any RIDE checkpoint, and there's a good chance that they'll smell just about any car that they care to target.
Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. The Ontario government is going after organized crime by trying to hit criminals where it hurts the most, right in the pocketbook. Phone's quite busy today. Let's go to Phil on line 3. Go ahead, Phil. You're on the air. Hi, Phil. Go ahead. You're on the air.
One is maybe it's that the provincial government is looking to decrease its funding now by opening up this avenue for the policemen to help generate their revenue. The other thing is we've already have so many problems with policemen abusing their power in this country, getting charged, half of them never getting prosecuted, and here we are handing over more rights to them, for them to subject innocent people to more abuse, and then there's no remedy to fix it.
Okay, Phil, I want to thank you for your phone call. Do you think that's a fair comment?
No. No, I don't. I think you see policemen being prosecuted, and I think, quite frankly, that the police services in this province, at any rate, take great pride in keeping their own house clean, and I think we've shown that. Nobody likes bad cops more than cops, and no, that's just a distasteful situation for us. We ferret out those that don't belong, quite frankly, as quickly as possible. But again, those people too are permitted due course and justice. They are innocent until proven guilty, and because it's in the headlines doesn't make it so.
Well, this legislation, though, because it is so broad, and because it takes what is essentially a criminal matter to civil court, even if there's no intended police malfeasance, doesn't it open the door, though, to mistakes being made?
Yes, unfortunately, there are human beings involved, and there will be mistakes made. That's the nature of being a human being, I think.
See, but if there are mistakes made at the criminal level, I mean, at least you have due process, and the case has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a good chance that you will be exonerated, although mistakes are still made. Look at Guy Paul Morin.
Absolutely. There are mistakes made because we don't live in a perfect society. I agree with you. But let's remember that there are gatekeepers here, that there is the courts, that there is the bench, that there are the Crown prosecutors, that there is the defense counsel in regards to these matters. Those are the gatekeepers. I have great faith in our judicial system. I believe in our judicial system. I think it works both ways, both on part of the society and part of the criminal. I believe that people are innocent until proven guilty. I believe that there is a separation in issues here. We're talking not about the criminal issues, we're talking about civil aspect in dealing with some of the monies that's siphoned off of our society.
But it's pretty punitive, though, if the Ontario government or the police department steps in and seizes your house and freezes...
To whom? It's punitive to whom?
Okay.
The criminal.
Well, let's just say that you're not, let's presume innocence. Let's say that you're not a criminal. You're accused of being a criminal. Your house is seized. Your car is seized. Your bank account is frozen.
A terrible mistake. We're talking about a very large...
That's pretty punitive. I think a lot of people would rather spend time in jail or even in prison than to lose all of their material wealth.
Well, I don't think they want to spend time in jail, but I do believe that, again, that there are checks and balances in place. If someone's house and car and all of their belongings are seized, I would suggest to you that behind those seizures there has been a very considered effort in respect to ascertaining where the monies came from, who the individual is, and there would have been a considerable amount of investigation prior to any seizure of those assets, home or car.
But if it's so considered, why can't you prove it in criminal court? Why not? Why not prove it beyond reasonable doubt?
Well, I think one of the issues in proving the issue of organized crime and membership in organized crime is addressed in legislation which has already been spoken about here in respect to the C-95 legislation, and there are grave difficulties in respect to the C-95 legislation, in my considered opinion. I think the issue of having to prove the 10 basic facts on each individual in respect to the prosecution, and that's not to say that that's not a good test or that it's not a good measure of what organized crime should be and how to prove organized crime. However, we spend millions and millions of dollars in this province in criminal prosecutions without any asset seizure. Millions of dollars in I think one of the most successful cases that I've seen in respect to organized crime was Project Omerta, which was a joint forces project which in fact seized assets worldwide. That was a 3.5-year project that involved incredible resources around the country and around the world, both from the joint forces project through CFSEU, through the combined efforts of police agencies around the world. And there was some criminal asset seizures in respect to that after the fact. Many of the assets were siphoned off during the course of the investigation, during the course of the prosecution, which will never be received back by this country.
Rocco Cleveland, our time is gone, but I want to thank you.
It's been fun.
So much for joining us today on the show. Don't go away. We're going to continue this conversation with a legal perspective on the issue. A couple phone lines open right now. Want to hear your thoughts? The number to call is 416-203-0302.
About this bill to Mr. Flaherty a few months ago, and he wrote back to me on January 15th stating that the bill contains an important number of safeguards, and foremost among these safeguards, he said, is the requirement of court approval at every step. Well, with all due respect to Mr. Flaherty, I can only consider that answer to be a joke. Who says that judges are any more impervious to the lure of money than police officers? The money doesn't have to be making a beeline directly into the judge's own pocket in order for judges to be tempted by this. Money going into the court system will mean they can hire more staff, have their offices redecorated, get upgraded notebook computers, get new courtrooms built, get salary increases or longer vacations. There are a lot of reasons why judges will be just as anxious as police officers to get their hands on the proceeds of organized crime. But Mr. Flaherty told me that there's another reason I shouldn't worry about this bill. It's because, and I'm quoting exactly from his letter, quote, more importantly, the proceeds of forfeiture are first made available to victims, close quote. Well, I have two problems with this answer. First of all, it isn't even true. The bill does not make proceeds available first to victims. There's a list in subsection 6.3 of the bill of 5 different uses to which this money can be put. And while compensation to victims does appear at the top of the list, this use is not given any priority over the other uses. They all have equal status. And 2 of the 5 uses refer to giving money to the province of Ontario or a municipality or other public body. And then the 5th item on the list is some other uses that are going to be prescribed by regulation. Well, I can hardly wait to see what those might be. But even if we suppose that money were going to go first to victims of organized crime, as Mr. Flaherty said, this unfortunately still does not put my mind at ease. Because the truth is that most of the victims of organized crime, most of the activities of organized crime, either have no victims at all or have no victims who would be willing to step up to claim their so-called compensation. The largest single activity of organized crime today is drug dealing. Who are the victims here? Do we really expect someone to come cap in hand to the Ontario government and claim compensation from this fund because the marijuana he bought turned out to be oregano? Or because he paid for a shipment of cocaine and it never got delivered, it had been seized by the cops? Or what are the other major activities of organized crime? Well, smuggling liquor is another big one. So who's the victim that's going to come claim compensation here? Some guy who got cirrhosis of the liver by drinking too much untaxed booze?
Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Joining our conversation, lawyer Paul McKeever. He's a spokesperson for the Freedom Party of Ontario. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rhonda.
I know you're absolutely outraged over this
I'm not happy about this at all.
legislation.
That's correct. You know, it's one thing to say that we need to protect people's property and their person, and frankly, Freedom Party and myself personally are 100% behind that. We think that's the appropriate role for government. In fact, the only appropriate role for government. But when you take centuries of law that respect the proprietary rights of every individual, and those rights to say, if you want to take this guy's property, you have to give him compensation at the same time, not later, but right away. Those rights evolved out of a morality that said that life is moral and that we apply our reason to produce so that we can survive. We produce property to survive. And to take one's property is effectively to interfere with one's life, to interfere with one's attempts not only to survive but to thrive. So to take one's property without compensating him is in fact immoral. And this bill purports to be, you know, a good tool for police, but it is in fact a step into or a step away from the respect we've always had for life and the pursuit of happiness, frankly, if you want to talk about it that way, but the right to live, to thrive, and to survive. We
already have seizure laws in this country.
Yes, we do, criminally, at the criminal federal level. My view on this law in particular is essentially what we're looking at is not a law that seeks to get at the problem by seeking a different remedy, by simply seeking property. What we're looking at is an attempt to get at criminals by lowering the standard that's necessary to find them guilty of their crime.
They only have to be suspected.
Well, they have to. I mean, the police do have to bring an application or an action, and then they can immediately bring a motion to have the property transferred to themselves, or to the Crown, rather. And the thing about this is that there is the pretense of a process going on, but it's nothing like the same thing we'd see with the, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just, is it more likely than not that this guy's a criminal? So you can imagine if you see a flake of marijuana in a guy's Ferrari, maybe he uses this Ferrari to transport drugs back and forth. If this woman has picked up a John, and this is the first time she's ever committed the crime of prostitution, perhaps her whole house was bought with proceeds of prostitution. So all of those things, keep in mind, it's not just the property she has on her. It's any property that probably arose out of a crime. And even if only part of it, the property arose out of the crime, the whole of the property gets to go to the state. This is an attempt to lower the standard, make it easy to grab stuff, and it's not entirely irrelevant that the property, once seized, can be sold, liquidated, turned into cash, and returned to the police so they can buy things like their helicopters, which at present are not very popular in Toronto, for example. So it is a revenue-generating tool for the police, among other things. And it is an easy way to collect property without necessarily giving people just the due process that they're entitled to.
Phones are ringing. Let's go to Brenda on line 8. Go ahead, Brenda. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi, Brenda.
I just wanted to say that I do support this legislation. I feel that there's a lot of fear-mongering going on.
Right.
And that I don't think that the police would just, as you gave an example, someone complains about your dog, that type of thing, and then next thing you know, they're saying that you're running a drug house and the police just come in. I don't really believe that that's going to happen. I think that the police go through a lot of investigations before they would even initiate or decide whether or not this was part of organized crime. I think that the police aren't stupid, and I do not believe that they're stupid. And I believe that when a bill goes through and it becomes legal, that it can be enacted, it will be enacted, but if it's abused, it can be unenacted.
Okay, Brenda, I want to thank you for your phone call. I don't think anybody is suggesting, certainly not me, that the police, that police are stupid.
No, far from it. In fact,
certainly not my intent, or that that they're all corrupt and all they're looking at is to seize your property. But
no.
However, to say that the police are protecting society, that statement's only half correct. Really, it's the laws of the land that are supposed to be our protection.
Well, that's right, and you have to look...
And if you have a law that is so wide and so broad...
Sure, I mean, you've asked the question, could this law lead to abuse? I think the first question is the law itself abusive? And I think it is. When the only standard required is, more likely than not, that this guy is dealing in dope. Well, hold on a second.
Right.
Even if he's been acquitted of that, you can take his stuff, because that stuff probably was purchased with the proceeds of his dope dealings. Well, who the heck knows that?
And it's not fear-mongering to say that Mike Harris is on the record as saying one of the great things about this legislation is that you can seize property without a criminal charge being laid.
Right. Yeah, there's no need to lay a criminal charge. And even if you have been charged, if you've been acquitted, or if the charge has been dropped even, they still can proceed. Now, the interesting thing is, how can you possibly, under this legislation, conclude that money arose from the occurrence of an offense if you haven't first proved that the offense occurred? It's ridiculous. This law is attempting to do what is logically impossible, and that is to just presume that an offense occurred, because otherwise we'd have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that an offense occurred. And then after presuming that the offense occurred, on a balance of probabilities, then on a balance of probabilities, concluding that this cash must have come from the crime because this person does crime. I think we're dealing with big leaps of faith here. And when you look at the immorality of taking a person's property, their means of thriving and surviving, I think we're not just we're not taking enough care when we say, well, we'll just add it to the toolbox. You don't just add to the toolbox something that so seriously interferes with, in some people's minds, God-given rights, but certainly rights that we all need to survive and to thrive.
And don't we have the constitutional right to due process?
We certainly do.
Now, property rights are not entrenched in the Constitution. Jim Flaherty, Ontario's Attorney General, has already addressed that.
Well, I might meet Jim in court in a few weeks if he pushes this thing through. Under Section 7, there's a life, liberty, and security of the person clause. In the courts, generally the term life has not had much effect in determining whether or not a given law is constitutional. But that's why I mention thriving and surviving. The right to life is a right to property. If you don't have a right to property, you have no ability to survive.
Indeed.
And I think that would be found to be the source of your protection of property were the case made in court.
Okay, we have to take a commercial break, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Rhonda London Live right after this.
Ladies and gentlemen, ask yourselves this question. What is it that the average Ontario taxpayer really wants the police force in his neighborhood to do for the taxpayers? The answer is really quite simple. Taxpayers want to sleep soundly at night knowing that their houses aren't going to be burglarized. They want to be able to go out during the day to work knowing that they don't have to install an alarm system just to protect their possessions. They want to be able to walk down the street without getting mugged or raped. Or if someone commits a fraud using their bank account or credit card, they want the police to get their money back for them. These are the things that taxpayers are willing to pay taxes for. But these are precisely the things that the police tell us over and over again they can't do for us. How many of you know someone whose house has been broken into? I'll bet everyone in the room does. And what did the police say when they were called? Sorry, there's not much we can do about it. A friend of mine recently had $16,000 stolen from his line of credit. It was probably an inside job involving someone from the bank. But what did the police say when he reported it? Sorry, but for individual frauds, we won't look at anything under $250,000. And for businesses, the limit is $1 million. You know, the average taxpayer really doesn't give a hoot that someone's importing marijuana into the country. A huge percentage of average taxpayers have smoked pot themselves. Probably half the people in this room have tried it. But we can only afford a limited number of police officers, and each of them can only work so many hours a day. So we have to make choices about how best to employ those police man-hours. And the average citizen, I'm sure, would say, get the burglars and muggers off the street and forget about the guys importing drugs and alcohol. Now, it's bad enough that our police already demonstrate the opposite priority. But if Bill 155 comes into effect, they will have an additional incentive to divert their resources to crimes that taxpayers consider low priority, because the cops and the police departments and the courts are going to be among the people on the list who get to drink from the trough once all those tasty crime proceeds start flowing in.
Paul McKeever, we're almost out of time, but do you think that this law will withstand a constitutional challenge?
I think there's a good possibility. History tells us that the courts have tolerated provinces who wish to punish criminal activity with proprietary remedies. So it's really up to the public to get out there and protest this bill. Hearings are on the 20th and 21st in Toronto.
Okay, Paul McKeever, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That is our show for today. Thanks for watching. I'll be back here again tomorrow at 2. Hope you'll join me. In the meantime, have a great day.
You're watching CTS Family